Hi, XFed here. It's very early in the morning. I'm very tired, and again, apologies about the presentation and whatnot, but it's early May when I'm making this recording, May 2023, and I'm not going to go into the specifics, but man, when it rains, it pours. That expression of when you get busy, you get really busy. And in my life, that happens a lot. I found it to be very applicable. I'm guessing it happens to a lot of other people too. Otherwise, that expression probably wouldn't exist. Um, and it happens not just in terms of good things and bad things, but just in general. There's a lot of things that all happen at once, and it's part of why I'm up so early trying to record these videos, because there's just very little time. And I need to get some of these made before I run out of time. So, as the title indicates, this video is about why I chose to work in government. I included a disclaimer regarding the topics, but just to be clear, I am going to talk about abuse and abuse of authority specifically, along with some pretty difficult circumstances. So again, I'm not going to go too far into depth on the specific individuals or organizations that I'm talking about, both for legal reasons to protect myself and to decrease the probability that these individuals might try to take legal or illegal action. But also from the perspective of I'm not ready to deal with legally, like I'm not ready to deal with the consequences that come with making public assertions about who has done what, and I need to have evidence and a number of other things lined up. So without further ado, there are two major events that happen. As some of my other videos regarding my emotional and personality development specifically show, there was a lot of abuse growing up, and there was a circumstance, a very difficult circumstance where one of my worst primary abusers became aware of my suicidal ideology and handed me a loaded gun and told me to kill myself. And I'm going to expand on what happened after that, to give context as to why this was abuse of authority. This individual held a position of public trust and authority, and following that circumstance where I was handed a gun, I didn't know how to deal with it as a 14-year-old. So eventually I ended up talking to somebody that I trusted. And if you're watching this before I go into it, to that person that I trusted, you know who you are. Thank you, because it was hard not being believed and being alone at that time, and you need people to believe in you when really bad things happen. So if you're watching this, I'm sure you already know, but I just want to say thank you again. So that person I talked to, they had a legal requirement that they had to report what I talked to them about and described to them with regard to this incident to authorities at a state level, and that included Child Protective Services. And my primary abuser used their position of trust and authority and knowledge of the system to do a few things. One, they prevented CPS from interviewing me. As I recall, there was never any interview regarding this event. And I mean, I put them somewhere. I have the records from CPS related to these circumstances, and the report related to this particular event seems to be missing. And I'll get into that. Two, my understanding is that they likely used their connections, their professional connections, and other individuals who lack integrity, aided them in finding out who made the report to Child Protective Services. And that should not have been possible, frankly. There are laws directly against it, and whoever aided them, along with my primary abuser, likely committed multiple felonies in the process. And the reason that they did that was because my primary abuser then went to the individual who supported me, and this is going to get a little confusing, but just to be clear, because I'm trying not to include additional details, the individual who was supporting me worked for an organization, and my primary abuser went to that organization and threatened to sue that organization if this individual who helped me ever had any further contact with me. And I hope that description makes sense, but basically my primary abuser created a de facto gag order preventing the person who was helping me from helping me any further. And that was horrible all on its own. That was just horrible. Just to go through, to be isolated again and not understanding what's going on, and like that individual, I could tell they were upset at the time. They were I'm not going to describe some of the stuff that happened afterwards because I don't want them to get in trouble. Not that I think that they would, but I don't. To be clear, I reached out to them afterwards, and they did their job, and they told me that they couldn't have any further contact with me, but it was clear that they were upset, and as I recall, they were crying. And that experience shaped their professional career. I caught up with them many, many years later. They were afraid that I was dead, so they were very happy to hear from me. And we reconciled and talked about what had happened in the aftermath and what was going on and the stuff that they didn't know and the stuff I didn't know. So again, thank you if you're watching this. And moving on, my primary abuser, they may have also had the records destroyed or sealed or done other things, which is why I can't access them. The CPS records that I recovered do not seem to include the mandatory report regarding this. So the level of abuse of authority is legally prohibited and ridiculous on its own. As a adult and citizen, it makes me angry that this was even possible. And I understand how it was possible. I understand that this was a position of trust and authority, but it was a shaping experience. So on that note, I'm going to leave that event as it was, and then move on to the next event. The next event happened 6 years later when I was in the military. 5 or 6 years. Again, I'm going to be vague with regard to everything that was happening. You'll have to go back and watch the videos, the other videos on personality development and emotional development. While I was still serving and trying to cope with being emotionally and mentally shattered, and having my worldviews directly challenged by what I was exposed to in the military, I worked hard to stay in the service. And that's going to be, it's not going to make a lot of sense looking back, and it's not going to make a lot of sense based on the nature of these videos, but at the time, you know, I made a commitment. I made a commitment to the military, I made a commitment to myself, and my goal was to stay in. And it eventually became clear that that was no longer possible. And my therapist recommended a discharge from service based on failure to adapt to military life. Just between the compounding PTSD between my childhood to the events that played out in the military, their recommendation was that I separate, and it made sense. And there was a person in my chain of command that I had been working with for many months to try to stay in. Like, I was talking to them, trying to be proactive and explaining to them that I was just having a hard time. I may not have shared everything with them, but I shared a lot, and I trusted them. And they were in a position of authority. You know, they're very high up in my chain of command. And I shared very intimate details with them regarding, where I was at mentally, and and really trying to stay in the service. And when they found out that I was going to be getting out of the military and being discharged for failure to adapt, they took it very personally. And I'm going to make a quick side note. This is not just me that they did this to. These things that I'm going to describe, the things that I'm going to describe, they were doing similar things, not necessarily the same things, to dozens, if not hundreds, of other people. There are circumstances that I am aware of where this individual, along with other people in my chain of command, received formal letters of reprimand from a general over what they were doing. They were directly violating people's civil rights and engaging in violations of not only due process, but violations of basic legal norms and procedure. So that side note aside, when this individual took it personally that I was leaving, and I didn't know this at the time. I was actually still sharing information with them, which in hindsight was part of the reason they were able to do some of the things they were able to do. But they started making my life hell. And by that I mean, like, I was I was getting randomly room inspected, and in the military you have to have inspections for your room. If you fail them, you can get in trouble for it. Basically, you have to have certain standards. You can't have stuff like money and other stuff out. It's a different way of living. But just to give some context for it, I was getting random room inspections, quote unquote, and failing them regularly. And some of them were legitimate. Some of them were not. Some of them, they would find things that I don't think they were actually that way. Like, they may have produced them. It wasn't hard to fail a room inspection. If anybody from the military is watching this, this was at tech school, so still that basic mentality. And I failed so many of them. And my superiors in my chain of command started looking for things. They started trying to find things that were wrong so that I would get in trouble. And I started getting all kinds of stuff that hadn't really been coming up. And anybody objectively looking at my military record will see that there was a dramatic uptick in the frequency of letters of counseling, letters of reprimand, and just basically this progression to worse things that come. And this individual, when they made my life hell, they instituted a policy on base where they would bring in, I'm just going to explain it in civilian terms, they would bring in the military drill instructors from basic, because where I was at was not too far from Air Force Basic. And they would come in on the weekends, and 2 days every week, for about 12 hours a day, you would get treated and live like you were in basic. And if you watched my other video, you know that for me that was traumatizing. And it wasn't traumatizing that going through basic itself. It was triggering. It was reminding me of things that I didn't want to remember with regard to my other abuse. So there was that. This individual, they did a number of other things, and eventually, and to be clear, this was definitely my responsibility, definitely something that I am accountable for. Eventually, I frankly snapped. I was having a conversation with a friend in a common area, and we were talking about philosophy, essentially, and warfare and history. And I made a comment that upset somebody else, and another individual came in, and they were intoxicated, underage, and we got into a shoving match. It didn't progress further than that, but I'm not going to go into all the details. I know what it looks like. I know how it was portrayed, and I know all of the circumstances that were involved now as an adult. And to a degree, it is embarrassing. But as far as intent, other than when I grabbed this other airman and pushed them out of my way and told them to get the hell out of my face, I had no criminal intent, no intent to cause harm to others. I was being open, transparent. So with that said, I was charged under Article 15 procedures within the UCMJ. For anyone who's not familiar with that, that is the Uniform Code of Military Justice. It is basically the law book within the military. And To be clear, charges under the UCMJ are just short of being, or an Article 15 charge is just short of being charged in court-martial, which for civilians, if you're convicted in a court-martial, that's a felony. Just to give a clear indication. And if the United States is at war when you're charged under the UCMJ, you're eligible for being executed if convicted under many of the articles within the UCMJ as far as the worst punishment. And the Article 15 process is just short of that. It is to allow commanders to have discretion. And while they're not good, obviously, Article 15s are much more common. And depending on the branch, they're not as common in the Air Force, but, oh my God, the Army, from my understanding, the Army hands out UCMJ punishments like there's no tomorrow. And it's common to have individuals rise through the ranks, I guess, with Article 15s on their record, which in the Air Force would never happen. Getting an Article 15 is a career-ending move. And maybe that's just my misperception of the Army. I'm not sure, but the rate that I saw people getting Article 15s was vastly different than in the Air Force. So following the beginning of Article 15 procedures, a number of problematic events took place. And not just from ethical standpoints, but some of the things that happened were clearly illegal. Following the confrontation that took place, I was ordered down to somebody in my chain of command, my lower level chain of command, and ordered to recount everything that happened that evening, everything related to the confrontation. At this point, I didn't know that there was an Article 15 on the table. I thought I was going to get probably a letter of reprimand, and I was ordered by this individual who was pretty high up in my local chain of command to go over everything, which I did. I did what I was told to do, and I was berated for it, and pretty normal military reaction. And I thought, I was going to get an Article 15, or not an Article 15, a letter of reprimand. And they didn't give me one. They sent me away, and I thought they were just going to process, like I didn't know what was going to come of it, but I thought they were just going to process it like a letter of reprimand and give it to me later. A few hours later, same day, like 3 or 4 hours later, I was ordered to put on my dress blues, my dress uniform. And for the civilian population that doesn't know what that is, this is your formal uniform that you wear whenever you go for example, command ceremonies or go to interact with senior officials. And I was ordered to put that on and to report to my commander. And normally I would be nondescript, but it's going to be obvious because Article 15 is non-judicial punishment handed out by a commander. So people can connect the dots, but it's just to give context as to what happened. So I go before my commander. He is pissed, and objectively looking back, I can't blame him. He was told certain things by folks within the command about what happened. He was given a certain side to the story, and he read, before he even said anything, he read me my rights under the UCMJ. Similar to the Miranda Rights that people have in the civilian world, but a little different. He had to sit there and read a little placard in front of him. And that was when I knew this was different, that this wasn't going to be a letter of reprimand. And he informed me that I was being reviewed under Article 15 procedures. And me, I was ignorant. I was a kid still, you know, and well, early adult, you know, lacking world experience. So I didn't piece quite a few of these things together until after I left the military, but he sent me away without me giving any comment or anything. He was very, regarding my commander, I believe he is a man of high moral standing. I still believe that. Um, and as a side note, I talked to him many years later about what happened, and he agreed verbally to help me try to upgrade my discharge status, because I'm not going to go into this too much on the video, but my official discharge status um, is an under honorable conditions discharge, and it's characterized as misconduct. It is not a fully honorable discharge. And my commander that day, literally that day, had a packet sitting in front of him on his desk that he referenced, and he said, "You were going to get an honorable, but we're going to review this now moving forward." Because he had the packet ready. And when I talked to him years later about what happened, he said he was willing to help me upgrade my discharge and challenge and stuff after I revealed a lot of these things that I'm talking about right now and going to talk about. So that side note aside, you know, he continued the Article 15 procedures, and eventually he calmed down, because under an Article 15, Uh, and of those things, I don't know if at this point he trusted the other individuals that were in the command, but eventually he calmed down, and my Article 15 reflects that he only took a stripe, which is a little bit of an unusual move for somebody that you've got through an Article 15 proceeding. Typically, there's some other action. It's very unusual to just remove a stripe. So I took that as an indicator, and that's part of the reason why I reached out to him many years later. I took that as an indicator that he thought there might have been something going on, or maybe he didn't trust the people that were below him. And yeah, I'm just going to leave it at that. And moving on, this individual in my chain of command, the abuser that I've been talking about, the one that abused their authority. Now I'm going to fast forward a little bit and reveal what I found out afterwards. This individual ordered the other individual in my chain of command to have me recount the entire story. And they told that individual to do this knowing that I was going to be charged under Article 15 procedures. That is a direct violation of the Fourth Amendment. That is a direct violation of your civil rights. You have a right to an attorney. You have, even in the military. And that should never have happened. And in fact, the evidence that was introduced against me, the stuff that happened, should have been thrown out largely because of the just under normative rules within law. Like you cannot do these things. It denies the right to a fair trial. It denies the right to fair legal proceedings. And there are criminal penalties for doing this kind of stuff, just to be clear. And this individual, I'm going to leave it at that, but just keep that in mind, that this is how they began the proceedings. So following the Article 15 proceedings, around this time frame, I'd been exercising. I still had a lot of liberties, even with everything going on and being put in basic every weekend. I still had a lot of liberties, and I'd been exercising as a way to try to relieve stress. I was going to the gym every day, and I was doing things like leg press at 1,000+ pounds. And when you do that as frequently as I was doing, it's unsurprising when you start developing stress fractures. So in my knees, at the bottom of the femur, I believe it is called. Yes, at the bottom of the femur, just above the knee joint, I had developed stress fractures and essentially broken the bones there on both knees. And the reason I'm going into this is because it's going to be necessary for context of what happened. I was placed on, and I was still doing training and everything else, but I was placed on medical waivers, which made it so that I could not be forced to march. I wasn't supposed to be doing exercise with my knees and stuff. And I wasn't supposed to be running, doing things like that to prevent additional damage and let the bones heal. This was done by my medical wing. This individual who's at the center of this abuse, used the Article 15 proceedings as a basis to unlawfully give me additional physical training. But they waited on implementing it. First, they sent me to a doctor, a non-military doctor off base that they personally knew, and had that doctor clear me of all medical waivers that I was on. And obviously I didn't know this at the time, but I'm giving you, the retroactive view of what happened. Once I was cleared of all waivers, I was given additional PT. I was made to run more, I was made to jump and do all kinds of stupid stuff. And the reason that's relevant is because the stress fractures developed from just fractures to meniscal tears and damage to the bones, as well as damage to the nerves. So to this day, I am largely service-connected within the Veterans Affairs system for osteoarthritis and neuropathy to a degree. The VA still doesn't recognize the neuropathy, which is from my knees down on both legs. I'm still battling the VA on that. This is 15+ years since I left the military. But they do recognize some of the damage that was done in the service. And the neuropathy was not clear at the outset, but the damage to the knees was severe, the meniscal tears. I kept complaining and ended up going back to my medical wing, and they sent me out for MRIs and stuff and found the tears. And I came in for an appointment that was supposed to be with a captain, what's that called? A physician's assistant, a PA. And instead of this captain showing up, I jumped up out of my chair because an 06 who was in charge walked into the room. He said, no, sit back down, at ease. And he proceeded to go over the results of the MRI, indicating that I had tears and had damage. And he reviewed my medical record. And I could tell in that meeting that he was pissed off. He said, I see that they removed your waivers. I'm myself going to put waivers in, and they're not going to be cleared because I am in charge of this medical wing. So he put new waivers in place. Waivers that were eventually ignored. I'm trying real hard not to say who this individual is. This individual who was in my chain of command abusing their authority. They also used the Article 15 procedures to put me in something called T-flight or transition flight, which was basically a much more restrictive lockdown version of military living. You're under lock and key. You're just short. Like this is, in the military, this is equivalent to almost corrective custody, except for they're not allowed to use corporal punishment. That was what T-flight was, where they had me do all kinds of physical crap. Like this, when I said they had me ignore my waivers, like they had me moving large furniture, like wall lockers, which to give a reference of that, we're talking about things that were made out of wood or steel that were, I don't know, 8 feet high by 3 or 4 feet wide by 2 to 3 feet deep. They had me moving that shit with people, and yeah, it caused more damage to my knees. I could feel it. There were days where my legs were just on fire, not from exercising. I was very fit at the time. This was damage. But this individual had me put in this T-flight to isolate me and to basically make it so that they could control what happened there. And this individual kept trying to push me, kept sending people that they knew personally to screw with me. And one example of this is on my birthday, something that's not hard to look up when you work for the government. You can look up somebody else's birthday if you work in the right spots. On my birthday, this individual sent somebody that they knew personally, not directly, indirectly connected to them, but not directly connected to them, to be in charge of T-flight. And that individual harassed me all day long, made me stand at attention for 4+ hours, which was directly against my waivers, my medical waivers. And then had me clean my room, I think 3 or 4 times, and kept failing me and harassing me. And then they said, "Do you want to hit me?" And they were intentionally trying to goad me into doing something. And I replied, "Yes, sir." Uh, so just to be clear, I'm having a hard time not naming individuals and naming what their roles and ranks and stuff were, and I keep making mistakes. So I am probably going to forget where I left off, but the individual that was sent to harass me then called the individual who was orchestrating a lot of this abuse, the primary abuser that I'm talking about here, that was abusing their authority within my chain of command, and tried and basically discussed with them whether or not I was going to be arrested. And this individual in my chain of command, who was primarily responsible for abusing and coordinating the abuse, he showed up in person and told me he was mulling over, having me arrested. And and this was just one day. And it is still my belief to this day that the individual who was orchestrating a lot of this was trying to get me to kill myself while I was in service. And like even the person who showed up on my birthday, they they were threatening me under UCMJ that if I screwed up, I might be killed and executed for it. And that's ridiculous, frankly. Like, looking back at it objectively, you know, for failing a freaking room inspection, you're going to execute somebody? Okay. We don't live in that kind of a draconian world, and if we do, then something is very wrong with our democracy. But when you're an ignorant teenager, you're afraid of those things. When you're under lock and key and under threat of being charged, one step short of being charged under UCMJ, you're afraid. And you take that very seriously. So between being afraid for my life and probably being encouraged to commit suicide, it was a very, very difficult time. And you know, the oversight systems that were in place, the Inspector General, there were no complaints, just FYI. My attorney didn't ask me. He was a good guy, but he didn't ask me, hey, did they violate your civil rights? I don't know if this attorney knew that there had been violations of due process previously with this individual, so they didn't ask me. And I didn't understand that what had happened was a violation of the Fourth Amendment and violations of due process at the time. So I didn't report it either. I didn't know. So oversight, didn't happen. I can't necessarily say it failed with regard to what I failed to report and what others failed to ask me, but I can say oversight failed because some of the individuals within the military knew exactly what was going on. And just to give an example, there was an individual who had a quote-unquote off-the-record conversation with me, and this individual was in charge of T-Flight. This was the primary individual running the operation. Sat me down and told me that this individual in my chain of command that was orchestrating all of this abuse had directly told the individual running T-Flight to be hard on me, quote unquote. And at the time, I didn't know why. But this is one of the early cracks in the facade, and I start seeing through what's actually happening. And it's one of the reasons I went back to try to piece together what happened, because the stuff that happened was not accidental. It was not. And yeah, obviously these stories are going to be biased because they're from my perspective, but there's enough evidence there that other people believe that some of these things have happened, and they were people who were there. So in that respect, oversight failed. These individuals who knew that unethical, probably illegal things were happening did not report what they knew. They followed the chain of command. And to that individual's credit, just to be clear, the individual running it, I'm not going to name them, they said, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to treat you fairly. If you act like a piece of shit, I will treat you like a piece of shit. If you act fine, I will treat you fine. And that was the purpose of the discussion. But if our system wasn't so broken, they probably should have gone and reported that to the Inspector General. And they didn't. So these two experiences overall, they shaped how I viewed the world. And there was this pattern. And these are the two worst experiences, to be clear. They are not all of them. And they shaped a pattern of basically failure of the system to hold individuals accountable. It just kept happening over and over and over again. There was abuse of authority and stuff that shouldn't have been happening, and there was no accountability. And as I stated in the other video, after the events that happened when I was 14 with the abuser and being handed a gun, integrity became very important to me. I started understanding the value of it, and I started acting accordingly. So then moving forward, and I'm going to try to, we're getting pretty long on time, so I'm going to try to wrap this up pretty quickly and move through things very quickly. When I was in college and thinking about work, I was also working for a federal agency and doing, menial tasks for them, but still working for the federal government and having exposure. I started exploring government options, and I used like my economics background to do analyses and stuff, while also seeking work that was meaningful. And with that regard, I started forming the belief that, at least within the government, you should be the change that you wish to see. And I know that quote is attributed to a lot of different places, so I'm not going to go into that. I'll leave a link in the comment section below. But for me, that was boiled down into competence and integrity. Those were the two things that I needed to have as a worker, and those were the two things that I demanded of those who I worked with. And that idealism has developed over time into more realistic perspectives, because there are legal limitations on what you can demand from others. What I decided on was that I decided that I wanted to rise through the governmental ranks within the executive branch and foster a culture of competence and integrity. Competence being people know how to do their jobs and they do them well. Integrity being people do what they believe is right, what they know is right, what they are legally obligated to. And even if the laws and stuff fail, then acting with ethical purpose. That became my mantra and the things that I wanted to spread in the government. And later, this perspective would also be shaped, and I would discover the challenges of this perspective, both in terms of integrity, like, people being coerced into doing things that they don't want to do, and fear of retaliation, stuff like that. I learned those the hard way. I learned, from observing others what happened when they tried to act with an integrity, and I experienced things myself for acting with integrity. With regard to competence, that was kind of tempered and shaped by learning about something called the Peter Principle. And I need to make a disclaimer here, because I need to make a few disclaimers here, because there are certain views in this book, the Peter Principle, that are antiquated and disagreeable. As I recall, that includes sexism and homophobia. And the other disclaimer I need to make is that there's value in listening to or reading differing views, dependent on the audience. But what value is taken away is dependent entirely on the audience, not the presenter. So even if you disagree with their fundamental points of view, it is important to understand them, to understand why they do the things they do or what they have. And there may be something of value that they have that you find that they have to offer. So in the Peter Principle, I found out about, how people rise to their level of incompetence. And I'll leave a link for the book. It's a good read. It's extremely pessimistic and entertaining, but I think it applies pretty universally in the U.S. and it's unfortunate. And my demands for competence have been shaped by that. I'm not giving up on it. I'm sure as hell not giving up on it. But it's a reminder for myself, and it's something I will remind others of. Do not let yourself rise to your level of incompetence. If you need to, step back down, because it's more important that you be competent and do your work correctly than it is that you get to the next level or increase the number of zeros on your paycheck. If our government is going to be improved, then I personally believe that that's what's necessary. And then the final disclaimer on the Peter Principle: just because we read something does not mean that we have to agree with it. So I'm gonna get all those disclaimers out of the way. But so yeah, that's my experiences with failures in oversight, failures in accountability, led to these beliefs. And they drove me to be the change that I want to see in the government. And that's why I work for the government today. That's why I do what I do today. And to a degree, that's why I've had to create these videos. I'm not going to go too far into that, but my competence and understanding of my role in the government has led me to create these videos. So anyway, hope to see you guys soon, and we'll go from there. XFed out.